going back to web natives, people that have only grown up knowing online, and it's sort of slightly answering one of the questions you've done again. Is this generation, are they going to be all right? Are the kids going to be doing okay, or should we?
Kids are all right. The kids are all right. No, I absolutely believe that the possibilities and the opportunities for people to live a rich, passionate life that allows them to express themselves in all the ways that they want to, regardless of where they live geographically. I don't think it gets any better than that.
Are the kids behaving differently online?
You know, it's not so much that they're behaving differently as much as that we have a sense of visibility that we've never seen before. So we're used to being able to see a certain group of kids in certain places, right? The mall, we can see kids hanging out with their friends that way. But as adults, we don't typically have a really good sense of all the kids and a good sense of where they are and what they're doing when they're with their friends. What's going on online is, in many ways, it's youth space. So they're there, they're goofing around as though they're there just with their friends. And so what ends up happening is you can get a sense of what's going on really in broad sweeps. And it isn't just the kids like the kids in your community, but the kids who are in different communities all around the world with all sorts of different ideas of what is normative behavior, right? And that what is normal, what is common really differs. And so we see these behaviors online and we're like, oh my gosh, it's radically different today than it ever was before. It's not really.
Well, I was going to ask that actually. How different is it from like when I was a kid, I'd come to the mall and I'd do stuff at the mall or I'd go to the movie theater or whatever. Right. How different is it?
Think about what happens when you were doing that with your friends, right? You were there, you were joking around, you were gossiping, you were flirting, you were kind of consuming culture and consuming merchandise, but it was part of this all-encompassing social experience. The same thing is actually happening fully online, right? So all of those everyday practices, the gossip, the flirting, the joking around, that's taking place online. And it's taking place online with the same kinds of friends that took place in the mall. Right? You met up with all the kids at school, but you also saw the kids at the neighboring school, and you're like, hey, who are you? What's that about?
Sherry, how is this generation different in terms of how much we give to other people in terms of our information?
Well, I think this generation has a sense that information wants to be free and information about themselves wants to be free. And in a way, there's a kind of self-surveillance that I think that young people don't think about in political terms. But it is a political issue. People put their lives on the screen. They put really intimate details of their lives out there, and with very little thought that there might be people using that information in ways that are not benign.
I think that social media is interesting. Would you stick a picture outside your house? No, probably not. But you are always framed in social media context in the world that you create. You don't have to accept people as your friends. You don't have to let the whole world see it. It's not really anonymous in the way that I think sometimes people get scared that it is. I think this all comes back to education, and it's all very well for me to sit here in my mid to late can I bear it 30s. Actually, you need to look at what 11, 10, 9, 8-year-olds are doing and how they're interacting with technology. And for me, they're the people that both can teach us but also need to be educated themselves. And this is where I agree with Tanya Byron's report about technology, that it's all good and to be embraced, but you have to underpin it with proper education about exactly those issues of identity and privacy.
That's an amazing thing. The social web can do more good in the world than it can do bad. And it's the choice of people and the people who are using it as to what they want to do with it. It is the most empowering generational shift that has ever happened. And I think that is what makes it so compelling and so inspiring and so much fun. When you look at the fact that you can be sitting in your pajamas on your couch and help drive, world peace, that is actually happening today. That's possible in a way that it was never possible before. And I think that that's something that is incredibly important. So, does it mean that people have shorter attention spans? Yes. But is that a bad thing? Maybe, depending on what your point of view is. But in terms of what it can actually enable socially, economically, and politically, I think that we should embrace and welcome social technology, not fear it.
Are there?
The one thing that keeps coming up is this idea of the exchange of private information. You know, how are kids exchanging or using private information as currency in a different way than perhaps adults are using private information as currency?
Well, again, what constitutes private information, right? From an adult's perspective, it's identifying information is their absolute fear, right? The idea that it's your name, your address, your phone number, anything that will identify you. And this has to do with the idea of physical risk. But for young people, it's about all right, fine, you can call me by my name. Why is that a big deal? It's more about the things that make you vulnerable. And so when we think about privacy and private information, it's really a question of vulnerability. And so from adult perspective, we're really concerned about physical vulnerabilities, and increasingly about psychological vulnerabilities. And for a lot of young people, it's about social vulnerabilities. So, how do I make certain that I don't get teased, harassed, bullied because of the things that I make available out there? How do I make certain that what I put out there makes me seem cool and not lame? How do I balance that? So the social vulnerability is the privacy fight for young people. The physical and psychological is the fight for parents. And so we see these two constantly at odds, because part of putting things out in public is to achieve status, you need to actually make yourself vulnerable at a certain level. And how do you actually do that in a way that balances the risks and the benefits?
I did an interview with a 16-year-old that is precious to me, because he talked about how he knows that people, can read his email. He knows that people, somehow he senses that his texts are being saved in some server in the sky. But he, when he wants to have a private conversation, he goes to payphones, and he feels that payphones are the only safe place for him to talk. I mean, you have this sense of even young people looking for the interstices of the system to find a little privacy. I don't think this is good. I think that, my grandmother, who came from a European background, taught me how to be a citizen at mailboxes in New York City, where she brought me down to the mailboxes. She said, unlike in Europe, where, bad governments would read your mail and open your mail, in America, it's a federal offense. She's saying it's a federal offense to read somebody else's mail. And that's what makes this country great. That kind of privacy is what gives you rights as a citizen. So in a way, I learned to be a civil libertarian. I learned to be an American at these mailboxes as a kid. I don't know where to take my daughter to teach her that. When we go through the Mass Pike and there's Easy Pass, my car is tracked, there's surveillance cameras all over. We're both giving up unprecedented amounts of information in profiling. I think that it's hard to teach the relationship between privacy and democracy, and it's also hard to teach the relationship between intimacy and privacy. What is intimacy without privacy? I think this is really a question for this generation.
What's interesting is that
people in their 30s, 40s, 50s see the web.
There's a massive generational difference in how people see the web, and that's one of the things that I find most interesting and exciting, not only just between classic generational breakdowns, but much more split and atomized fragments of early 20s to late 20s to mid 20s. It's more about kind of the stage of life you're at as well, I think, and where you are in the education cycle. If I look now at how 8, 9, 10-year-olds use the web, it's completely different to how somebody aged 18 would use it, completely different how I would use it again. And I think that one of the issues around the privacy questions that are now being raised are, have we taught children how to be safe online enough? And are we, aware enough, if we've come at this later with technology, of all the different ways that information is used? So there's definitely a piece of education that needs to underpin all of the developments that are happening in technology.
Yeah, we're seeing patterns, and a lot of it has to do with their particular social positions, right? So the popular kids are using the technologies to try to maintain and reinforce popularity in very particular ways, and that's where we see social status becoming really critical. So it's no longer the Nikes that are the particular status markers. It's the way of actually maintaining certain kinds of friendships and getting certain kinds of responses from certain celebrities. All of that play goes on. We also see marginalized kids who were desperately seeking some sort of support, and were often at loss, out in more traditional senses of schools or whatnot. finding a community online, and this is one of the more powerful narratives of the internet, right? Your queer kids who can actually find people like them, who can support them. They're much more willing to be public in a traditional sense because they're desperate for somebody who might be like them. For the popular kid, it's much more about being public to the school, people who will give them credit, that will give them status. And so we see these different groups contending with it differently. We also see the power of certain public figures, in negotiating with teenagers. So if you think about which teenagers are using Twitter in the earliest of stages, a lot of it comes down to who's talking to celebrities. And this wasn't that different from when I was growing up, and the idea of writing to the new kids on the block, right, the boy band of the day, in the hopes that you would get a letter, in response, right, which was inevitably a form letter, was the possibility of reaching out and getting a response, feeling as though that person really existed and they really recognized your existence. Twitter is a modern day incarnation of that for a lot of the celebrity teenager relationships, right? Can I get validation from, Miley Cyrus, who's now left Twitter, or Demi Lovato, or any number of these particular celebs? The idea that maybe I can actually get to meet Shaquille O'Neal in person because he'll announce where he is, right? All of that possibility. So you see that as another component. So there's always these publics, and these publics keep coming back, but the same practices are there.
Withdraw. I think of Thoreau and talking about where I live and what I live for, and saying that the most important things were deliberateness and living your life and living in the moment. This is no longer a generation that lives deliberately, that lives its life, that lives in the moment. I think that has time for reflection. We ask ourselves questions. If the velocity and volume is such that I send you a tweet, or I send you a text, you have to answer me back. You can't. Nobody answers a text by saying, I have to think about that for 2 weeks. The communication demands a response. Well, that means that we start to ask each other questions that are easy to answer. And so I think we live in a kind of paradoxical time, and we're giving our teenagers a paradox, or the whole generation, not just our teenagers, but our babies growing up, a very paradoxical message. The world is more and more and more and more complex. On the other hand, we're only going to ask you a question that you can answer in 2 seconds. So we leave ourselves less and less time for reflection because our communications media push us to quick responses. And quite frankly, the questions before our planet right now are not questions that should be answered or thought about in the time space of texting.
Fantastic.